Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Cut the Shit,
a podcast that takes a closer look at the IT industry, both the good and the bad.
My name is Cameron Plato.
And I'm Bryan Law.
And I'm Bryan Link.
On today's episode, it is my distinct pleasure to have Andrew Blum as our guest. Andrew is a journalist and book author who has spent the past 15 years or so writing about a variety of topics, including technology infrastructure. His 2012 book called Tubes is the definitive work on the physical internet, the tubes that carry the data. It may not sound like it, but it's a beautiful and informative book, and we use it as the jumping-off point for a wide-ranging conversation about data privacy, security, and how things have changed in the past 9 years, which is like a century in internet time. I have to confess that Tubes is my favorite book about the internet, so I couldn't be more excited to get the chance to talk with Andrew about it. I hope you enjoy our discussion. Andrew, welcome to Cut the Shit. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bryan.
Everybody laughs at the name if you're not familiar with it. This is what we came up with. So, it is what it is. So it maybe gives you some idea of what you've gotten yourself into.
I didn't know how the S was pronounced, but now I hear it. So yeah, it's good.
Gotcha. So for the benefit of, I know a little bit about your background, but for the benefit of the listeners, why don't you kind of give us a little bit of background about yourself? Tell us sort of where you grew up, education, and kind of how you got into being a writer.
Yeah. I've been a sort of journalist now for it's kind of my 20-year anniversary of my first big piece. I grew up in New York City, left for about 10 years, but have been back here now for about 15 years. Went to school in Massachusetts at Amherst College, studied literature, not technology at all, but I was always a geek. My dad brought me to Macworld in 1986 or whatever it was. Wow. Original, grew up with the TI-994A and a Mac Plus and all that. Was just always loved this kind of geeky idea that we'd have these, crazy maps and GPS and two-way radios and all the things that we now kind of live with all the time. So I think it kind of way back, even pretty early on, before I was writing more about technology, but was writing more about architecture and about buildings, kind of began to see what was coming down the pike in a way that's kind of come true, more than I ever could have dreamed. So that's been exciting.
So you mentioned architecture, and obviously in the prologue to Tubes, you talk some about that in terms of being sort of initial writing area of focus. How did you get into that? How did you sort of transition into that as an area of focus?
Yeah, I thought going around looking at buildings seemed like kind of a cool job. And I thought that sort of being an architecture critic or an architecture writer would be a way to do that. And particularly in the kind of 90s and early 2000s, there was just a ton of writing about buildings going on. It's a kind of pretty exciting moment in architecture when you had the kind of birth of sort of starchitecture and all these, real kind of monumental, iconic buildings. It was just kind of my sort of first passion with this. I thought for a while I might be a poetry critic, but that seemed kind of crazy. A building critic seemed a little bit more relevant. But I also kind of always loved sort of, big systems, subways and power lines and things like that. So I actually I was kind of a failed graduate student, but I did do a 1-year degree in human geography, where I studied kind of sort of urban planning and sort of place philosophy kind of weirdly. And I finished the year and they told me that if I wanted to, I could go on and get my PhD, but they didn't recommend it. So I kind of took that seriously.
You took that as words of wisdom?
Yeah, I immediately turned around and asked one of my classmates if I could turn her, 8-page master's thesis into a 800-word article for a magazine. And she said, okay, yeah, whatever. And kind of never looked back. So.
Gotcha. Excellent. As you kind of think back over your career, it sounds like you've written about a variety of different things. What would you say are your top 2 or 3 sort of either favorite articles or favorite topics that you've dealt with over that time span?
Yeah, I'm kind of fickle about that. So it's always the kind of most recent ones that that'll end up being the favorites. Let's see. Let me go back in time first. I think I wrote a piece for Wired. It must have been 2007 or 2008 about the redesign of the airspace over New York, like the air traffic control. And I remember, and that was just kind of this perfect combination of thinking about these systems and patterns and maps with planes. And I got to spend a day in the tower at Newark Airport. And I remember kind of standing next to the controller, like landing planes, being like, this is exactly like this is why I want to become a journalist. Forget going to look at like art museums. This was being in the looking at being inside the control tower at Newark was like a high point. So that was one. One piece I just finished about nuclear power, about nuclear microreactors, that was published in Time just a few weeks ago. That was pretty exciting. Nuclear power has just got an incredibly complicated dynamic right now between being a real possible sort of saving grace for low carbon power, but with a lot of complexity, a lot of baggage, a lot of cost. And looking at this one startup in particular that's kind of sort of recasting it in a pretty interesting way was exciting. And then I'd have to go with the story that became Tubes, and that was wild because I pitched my editor at Wired and said, we forgot about the wires. We got to do something about the wires. And this was 2008, 2009, and he immediately ran around the office and said, "Oh, Andrew's got this great idea. We got to write. We totally forgot about data centers, and nobody was writing about data centers or anything at the time. It just wasn't on the radar." And he immediately got a green light for the story, but they decided it was going to be a photo essay, and it was going to be 500 words of writing and 6 photographs. And so that's when I decided to.
So pictures of wires or data centers, which are, I mean, I've seen a lot of data centers. They're super exciting. I can imagine why they would want to have pictures.
It was the photo essay that came out was pretty great. It was pretty fun. With great photographer, a guy who somehow they hired a guy to do it whose sort of main claim to fame was some of the original Calvin Klein underwear ads, but they had him sort of go around and shoot internet infrastructure instead. But
I don't know. I don't know what that feels like on the photographic career ladder, going from Calvin Klein models to switches and routers. I'm not sure.
Over that, I think. Yeah. I think he hired like a cherry picker to like get him up above a cable landing beach or something like that. He managed to get some out of it. So
he made lemons out of lemonade, or lemonade out of lemons, so to speak.
Yeah.
I gotcha. Very cool. Well, I think that's probably a good transition point to talk some about Tubes. Obviously, that's the primary reason I reached out to you, because this book to me is a really interesting book and a super important one if you're someone who works in the internet space. And to your point, forgetting about the wires, we live in a world where it's sort of hard to forget about the wires, at least at the office when we think about the job that we do, because we do a good bit of networking, managed services and network consulting. But everywhere else, there's still no really talk or awareness of the wires. I was talking to my kids who are 23 and 21 about this, and they sort of laughed and they said, "That doesn't sound like a very interesting story." And I immediately went into sales mode and was like, "No, you don't understand. You got to read this book." And I can't decide if I'm right about that or if it's just an old guy trying to get somebody to understand something that is completely so far out of context that it's hard to reach. But I think the book does a great job of that. But anyway, to get it started, I'll start with kind of where you started, with the former senior senator from the great state of Alaska, Ted Stevens, a real internet guru, to anybody who remembers him. Not exactly. Not that Congress is known for its technical, know-how, but nevertheless, he was probably maybe even further non-technical than most. But he was pretty prescient, in 2006 when he made that little speech in the Senate committee about talking about Netflix and net neutrality, and said, the internet, he compared the internet or described the internet as a series of tubes. And he was roundly mocked for this. But if you think about it, I think you make the argument, and I think it's a successful argument, that he was 100% right about that, at least in its, at a very sort of visceral level. How did you feel finding yourself being a tech writer defending Ted Stevens' honor in this particular book?
It was, there was always the joke was always at hand. We kind of knew right from the beginning that this book was going to be called Tubes, kind of in tribute to what was kind of one of the original memes.
Yep, for sure. It was a meme before there was such a thing, right?
It was a meme. It was absolutely a meme before there were memes. And when you ask people what the internet was, and again, things have changed pretty dramatically. Before we had iCloud, before even the cloud existed hardly as a marketing term. When you said, "Oh, I'm going to look at what the internet actually is," that at least in 2009, 2010, almost everybody would immediately say, oh yeah, like a series of tubes, and that's that was kind of right at hand all the way there. But it was also the other piece of it, and this speaks to kind of Ted Stevens' sort of ignorance with it, or all of our ignorance with it, is that none of the people in the industry had the people who ran data centers, the telecom folks and the undersea cable folks, they hadn't nobody had paid any attention to them. So as a journalist, kind of calling them up and saying, what's can I hear more about what you're doing? They hadn't gotten any of these calls. I mean, I remember I went to NANOG, which is I write about in the book, the North American Network Operators Group. They never had a journalist come to the conference.
Did they have any PR people or anything? They probably didn't have a clue, right? I mean, yeah.
They didn't do it. So, and they're like, okay, if you want to come see what we're doing, sure, why not? There was no sense that this was interesting, to a broader audience. It was also a moment where things were just getting, where the Googles and barely Facebooks, primarily, it was really Google by that time, but they were really just beginning to kind of connect directly to other networks and to cable operators, and the whole idea of peering that's been so important for the growth of the cloud barely existed as a kind of political or economic discussion at all. So there's just so much that was kind of nascent that's grown up incredibly over the last 10, 12 years. So.
Yeah, and so I want to kind of step back in time a little bit with you. I know the book is 8 years old now, so I'm going to have to ask you to sort of dig back a little, because I want to talk some about the reception, or sort of how people dealt with it and experienced it at the time, and then we'll come forward to today and talk about sort of where we are, and maybe try to look retrospectively and do some comparisons and think about it. But when you think back to that, published in 2013, so you probably did some publicity and some other things on the back end of that. What most surprised you about some of the initial reactions to the book, both maybe negative and positive?
Yeah. Actually, 2012 was the hardcover. So May 2012. I mean, I think that there wasn't this suspicion about big tech as there is now, and big tech also didn't do as much for us as it does now. It was kind of double-edged. So we didn't. The Netflix streaming was still pretty new. I think there was barely Amazon streaming. There's just all of these things. The iPhone existed, but it wasn't. It's just really kind of. Uber had. My first Uber ride was fall 2012, I think, in San Francisco. Just all of these things. Ordering just dinner starting. On your phone. Yeah, I mean, and not even starting really. And so this whole idea of the kind of way in which. The way in which technology and the way in which our devices are, and the way in which the internet is sort of so much woven into our lives. I mean, even before you get to the pandemic, just didn't exist. And so I remember kind of saying, as a kind of a refrain with a lot of the press, it's like, well, okay, why do we care? Why does it matter? And it was always this kind of more abstract, like we should know where our internet comes from, like we should know where our email lives, like we should know, how these companies work, and that was kind of it seemed a bit, a bit Chicken Little, that I was so concerned about what was, who was running these places and how they worked and what was behind them, and the risk of control seemed kind of far off, because that just wasn't the world we lived in the way that we now. Talk about Facebook or YouTube or Amazon's control over different marketplaces and different public conversations. But what was clear was a lot of question about privacy and a lot of question about your own personal control over your data. And so I kind of watched with a lot of interest over the last year, more than that, few years, as big tech has kind of come under greater scrutiny. And as we've kind of become more familiar with the power that they hold, these were questions that were framed very differently in 2012. I mean, the question was really about privacy. It was really about, what does Facebook know about you, right, rather than what
sort of a traditional, what I would have think of as sort of the traditional libertarian concern around privacy, right, and just extend it into the internet realm or the big tech realm at that point.
Yeah, and not, nowhere near, we kind of give, that ship has sailed. We don't really talk about the extent to which that privacy has taken over. Certainly, the political lines have been totally scrambled in that conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, when you think about those reactions, did you get different reactions from sort of non-technical people versus technical people? I'm curious about that distinction.
Yeah, well, technical people, are always eager to tell you how you're wrong. So that's this.
Sure. I read the comments on Amazon, and of course, all of the critical ones were clearly, nerds who were, upset about your lack of precision of describing exactly the way the internet works. According to the way they think it should be described. So whatever.
Yeah. No, I was pleased. A lot of the technical people who actually were inside these communities, Nanog and undersea cables, were very positive. We're super excited that I kind of illuminated the work that they were doing. So that there were others who, yes, in classic kind of nerd fashion, were frustrated by either my imprecision or my sort of attempt at poetic musings about about how the internet works. But it really, it was a moment where there was no popular cultural image about inside of a data center. Google had never shown a picture of the inside of their data centers. And actually, the first time they released pictures of the inside of their data centers was in the fall after Tubes came out. And I think it was a project that was basically commissioned around a lot of my kind of poking at them for being so secretive and skewering them. They are kind of the villains in the book, not to give away the end, because of the way that they refuse to engage with a conversation about the public needing to understand how their systems work. That's changed 100%. They're still very secretive in some ways, but it's just a given that if you're going to sell cloud services, you show people what your cloud physically looks like, what the inside of your data center looks like. The conversation has changed incredibly dramatically. We haven't talked about Snowden as well. Snowden, the first Snowden revelations, I think were 2013, a year later. And that again scrambles the entire conversation about what the dynamic is between our own liberties, the power of big tech, and how that fits in with the physical infrastructure.
Yeah, and even that one to me it's interesting when I think about that. I'm a libertarian by sort of inclination. I'm in a lot of ways very lean in that direction. And during the Snowden revelations and those discussions that followed, right, the big concern that I remember, at least the way I found it to be positioned, was sort of the cooperation between government and these private companies to sort of help the government, continue to sort of invade our privacy, if you will, right? That's a fairly negative or spin. Others may see it differently in in terms of anti-terrorism, whatever. But this idea of being able to soak up all this information really required cooperation between government and big tech in a way that a lot of people didn't think that was actually going on, right? And now I think about the discussion, it's almost the opposite of that, right? Like it's almost like the government is somehow helpless at the feet of these larger entities, whereas at that point it still felt like the NSA was way more powerful than Facebook or Google at that particular point. Now maybe that was my own take on it, but it seems to sort of reflect, I think, what you were describing in terms of the scrambling.
Yeah, I remember before the Snowden revelations, I remember being very suspicious about the sort of what seemed to be conspiracy theory about NSA snooping in some ways, because I had seen how the internet worked, and it seemed implausible that there was a sort of shadow internet that the NSA was running. But what I hadn't counted on was the excess, was the sort of basic, just sort of backdoor that the NSA had added.
Yeah, they were let in, right? To your point, you wouldn't be able to do it without help, right? That was where your skepticism was coming from, which was well founded, right?
Right. And for me, it pointed to another big theme, which is that we now don't really have an internet. We have a supernet. We have an internet that's essentially dominated by Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple to a lesser extent. The way in which the vast majority of internet traffic really is sort of Facebook and Google or YouTube and Instagram built into that. I think it's up to something like 2/3 of telecom traffic is the content providers globally. Just astounding numbers. So this initial notion of the internet as especially the libertarian idea of the internet as a network of networks where no one is in control, is now completely false because of the growth of these particular giants.
It's the idea of the network effect taken to its logical conclusion, right? And this is what has happened in that sense, right? And I mean, no one has dictated it. It wasn't top down control in that sense, but nevertheless, in terms of aggregations I hesitate to use the word power, but there is power in that, right? I mean, even in the libertarian circles in which I've listened to people talk, they're like, well, people just don't have to go on Facebook. And that's 100% true. You don't have to go on Facebook. You don't have to use any of the big guys if you don't want to. But so many people do that by its own, sort of self-organized structure, right? It's still an aggregation of power in that sense, which is, I think, problematic. And realistically, almost none of our, sort of existing tools for dealing with that fit the mold. I mean, I think that's part of, forget about whether we're being intelligent about how we think about the problem, because we're probably not. But the reality is, even if we were, it's not one that's easily solved in this context.
And my premise in 2009 and my premise now is that you need to shine the light in. you need to know what these networks are made of. You need to know sort of how they fit together and who runs them and who operates them and sort of what the kind of ownership, what the ownership structure is and all of these things. And to be sort of basically held accountable, and sort of basic knowledge that helps us make these decisions. And it's been actually quite a remarkable season for that. Even now, I don't have it on my desk, but the current issue of Time has Hoaxen, the Facebook whistleblower, sort of classic whistleblower profile of being inside and seeing stuff that she didn't think was right, and exposing all these documents then for discussion, which is another tool to hold power to account. But it's quite striking to me that in 2009 or 2010, when I wanted to go visit Google's data center, they said, "What do you want to see? These are trade secrets. What do you have to gain from this?" I was saying, well, the first step in sort of understanding the kind of control that you're amassing and the way in which you essentially operate all the communications, upon which we now rely. We're using Microsoft Teams today, but that could have been a different choice. Is the first step in that is just knowing where this data is, and that was not a conversation that was happening then. You could not find the locations of Google's data centers in 2009 or up until really 2012. They did not. When I visited the Dalles, the original Google data center, there was not a sign out on the facility. That's hard to imagine now, but it was absolutely the case. So we, even with that increased transparency, we're still in a position of just incredible, perhaps unchecked power of the large technology corporations. Well, also, I think it's important acknowledging how successful and how much they bring to our lives. Right. I used to think it was a naive choice on the part of consumers, that if we knew what they knew about us, then we wouldn't do it. But I actually have come to learn that people are quite happy to make that exchange of personal data for services they offer, some of which are very good.
I agree. Yeah, these are all, because what we're talking about are mostly almost all free services, right? In the sense that no one is quote unquote paying for them, right? There are no tolls on that particular road. So we've talked specifically and talked around them to a bit, but it did, when you think back to the book, in the book, you talk a good bit about security concerns, but a lot of it was around the security of the physical places themselves, right? The exchanges, the POPs, the data centers, and at least implicitly and in some places explicitly thinking about, there's inherent vulnerability in these aggregations of, particularly at the exchange level, right? Where you've got all this peering and all this cross-connecting going on, right? And there's a bunch of value in everything being together, but it also mitigates against the idea of the distributed nature of the internet, right? In that sense. It still was distributed, meaning everybody around the world could access it, but the way it was actually delivered wasn't really distributed in that sense, because it had to pass through these sort of aggregations of connections, right? So when you think about that, and how do you make sense of that in the context of what we're seeing around security breaches now? And really, it really hasn't played out that physical vulnerability has been the way people have caused problems, right? It has been mostly truly internet based as opposed to physical penetration based. Is that surprising to you? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it never. Well, there were moments where people expressed concern that I was revealing locations, but that ship had already sailed. Even at the time I was doing that, I remember having a conversation with the I think I write about this in the book, but with the head of security at a major telecom, who said, we're happy for you to write about our facilities, just don't say where they are. But this was in the relatively early days of Google Maps, and he hadn't realized that sort of Google Maps knew where he was. If you punch the name of his facility and the land,
there it was.
There it was, flag land right in the mid-lane. And of course, we take that for granted now. It's almost impossible to keep any of these locations secret. But yeah, no, I think that the redundancy and the aggressiveness of any kind of physical attack, and the kind of clarity of the difficulty of getting away with it compared to cyber attacks, have all kind of worked in the internet's favor. There are still outages that have physical causes. That has happened, with a lot of regularity, but there haven't been really the kind of catastrophic physical attacks that have caused real consequences before. And I think that's less a matter of luck and more a matter of it just not being the path of least resistance for causing trouble. That said, I did have the opportunity a couple of years after Tubes came out, maybe a little bit 2014, 2015, but I visited the Department of Homeland Security, kind of like critical infrastructure sort of command center. And as late as that, 2014, 2015, their telecommunications sort of overwatch was really based on the traditional telecoms. They had they were plugged into AT&T's network, or they were plugged into Verizon's network or whatever, and they had sort of direct lines into all the control rooms there, and sort of were kind of keeping an eye on things in that sense. And I said, what about Google's network or Facebook's network? And they said, oh, they won't let us in. We don't have any transparency into that. So essentially, even into the mid 2010s, there wasn't the recognition at the Homeland Security level that Google's network was a major communications conduit, and Google liked it that way.
Yeah, sure.
So, but it shows some of that departure from the traditional telecom being kind of a utility, into what is essentially what's meant to be a sort of privately owned network of networks, but now is a privately owned network of just a very few networks. That kind of consolidation really goes all the way up and down the stack, right down to the international telecommunications cables that are now more and more owned by Google and Facebook. So.
Okay, so let's fast forward. We've kind of bounced back and forth. So we haven't been living in 2012 or 2013, but we've talked some about the past. So let's kind of bring it to today. If you could write an updated version of Tubes, circa 2022, what are some of the things you'd maybe like to revisit?
Well, I think that one of the things. Actually, I'm writing something now that's going to be out hopefully pretty soon that reflects on this. But I think one of the biggest things has been the extent to which Google, Facebook, Microsoft have taken over the infrastructure of the internet itself. And that's apparent not only in data centers and in the robustness of their national fiber networks, but it's astonished me to see both Google and Facebook spend as much money as they have. Small change for them, because they both have so much money. But on international submarine cables. So you have an incredible building program on Google's part, to lay sort of massive capacity cables across the Atlantic, across the Pacific. Both Google and Facebook have enormous cable systems to Africa now and to Asia, in construction or in planning. And because the undersea cables last 20 years, what it means quite clearly is that the international infrastructure of the internet will be owned by Google and Facebook for the kind of foreseeable future, all the way up and down the stack. So not just about you're using Google services, but they actually own the cable in the water, or own a significant portion of the cable in the water, and that was unfathomable 12 years ago. It was unfathomable because you had content providers and you had telecoms Now we don't really have telecoms anymore.
Right.
Is Zoom a telecom? Like we don't really. It doesn't quite exist that way. And so you have this kind of reversal of the ownership structure of the physical infrastructure of the internet, where it used to be telecoms selling capacity to content providers. Now you have content providers cutting off the last little sliver of their capacity for telecoms, and what that means for what that potentially means for control is kind of TBD. But forget Facebook controlling the news stream. You have a complete ownership of our communication networks that goes kind of unremarked upon. Whether or not Facebook's ownership of those communications networks is better than Chinese owned cables is a kind of active discussion now, particularly in places like Africa, where that competition is very direct. But it's pretty astounding. I would have been shocked 12 years ago if you said this was going to happen. So
yeah, I don't know that anybody necessarily foresaw that, right? I mean, it was more, even the early discussions around net neutrality or other things presupposed, right, just a division of ownership between sort of the telco side and the content side, right? I mean, in that sense, because it was then about, well, how do we prioritize, or should we prioritize? It was more about, well, if someone can pay more, then can they get, it's like Disney Fast Pass was always sort of the description in my mind that, when I initially sort of conceived of the net neutrality argument, right? Is this going to be a Disney Fast Pass model where you pay more and you get, preferential treatment? In this sense, it's, well, we'll just lay our own lines, right? And then we don't have to deal with, no one can decide what, there will be no governance around what happens through that particular cable, right? It's private point-to-point networking all over the globe, which is sort of hard to imagine, right? That's an incredibly expensive proposition.
It's an expensive proposition unless you mint money with your advertising, but yeah.
That's right. Yeah, which is one of the greatest businesses that ever, when I went to business school, one of my favorite case studies early on, this guy said, the best business in the world is a post office box where people send cashier's checks and everything else is a step down from there. And internet advertising is not too far off from there. Right? It's really has great economics if you can get the scale.
And credit where credit's due. I mean, it's led to enormous productivity. They're amazing businesses. They've created incredible value. But there obviously are other consequences that we're still fully exploring.
Sure, which we haven't figured out yet. And I mean, you may be more skeptical than me about the future. I don't know, but I'm very comfortable saying I don't know, and neither does anybody else. Right? We better be wrestling with it though and figuring it out. I think that's a fair characterization, regardless of where you sit in terms of the punditry side of the equation. So.
I would say the coda to this idea of Facebook building cables. I mean, they're one of the biggest projects is To Africa cable that essentially is going to dominate African telecommunications for the next 20 years. That said, when I first heard about it, I was like, oh my God, Facebook is gonna sort of own the connection to a continent for a generation. 2 billion people. But but what I hadn't appreciated is the plausibility that Facebook would no longer exist in its current form. I hadn't registered that they might build this cable and then somehow be broken up in some way. But
sure, yeah, I mean that's what I mean. There's at the end of the day, there's still there's a lot of dynamism all around in both the marketplace and the public policy arena. So it will be interesting to see sort of how it shakes out. I'm thinking they didn't make that investment thinking they were going to get broken up either. So it's not something they're going to take easily. That's for sure.
And what used to be a bankrupting event in the original broadband boom around 2000 is now a kind of a fraction of Facebook's capex for the year. Just kind of barely registers. Yeah, a couple $100 million. But
it's funny. This makes me think of this next question that I had written down. I think sort of folds into this fairly nicely. So when you wrote Tubes, there were roughly 2 billion internet users. I think that was the number you quoted in the book. And I looked it up for 2021, and I found various estimates, but pushing 5 billion was what I found most recently. With mobile devices driving most of that growth, right? That's probably the biggest step change from where we were in 2010 to 2012 when you were writing the book. It was still mostly computers connecting to the internet over a line, right? Maybe some Wi-Fi, but mostly over a line. What implications do you think that has? That sort of really exponential growth. I mean, we're talking about that's a lot more people onto these, onto this network of networks. What do you think? What are the implications from your perspective on the physicality of the internet? I mean, what the physical infrastructure, can it continue to do the job based on what you know about it and the research you did?
Yeah, I mean, the astonishing sort of miracle of fiber optic technology means that, it keeps, if you can lay that glass tube between two places, we keep increasing our technological capability to light it up with kind of ever increasing amounts of bandwidth. I mean, I used to, there was certainly a moment, I mean, just speaking as kind of a US consumer, there was certainly a moment where the network was not keeping up with my demands. Saturday night, Netflix would stutter, et cetera, et cetera. To the kind of broadband providers' credit, to the cellular providers' credit, those often, I think it's more common to kind of feel like you have the bandwidth you need. It might not have been everybody's experience, and certainly during the pandemic in particular. But that said, I have been a little surprised by the way in which, if you've got a 200 or 300 meg connection at home, or even if you have a gig connection at home, you're not really asking for much more these days. I don't know, maybe if you big gamers or something like that, but.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you've got edge cases, but outside of that, the average person's broadband needs. I mean, I have a 100 meg connection at home. I work from home. We watch, we have, we cut the cord. We have voice over IP phone. We have TV on the internet. We've got multiple devices going in the house at various times, and it's all running on Wi-Fi that then is hitting the 100 meg pipe. And and that's I say 100 meg. It's not 100 meg dedicated, right? It's broadband, so it's never 100 meg. Actually, it's more usually.
That was my pandemic tip when people said none of our Zooms are working, and I was like, well, it's not your connection. It's your it's your router. Get a smarter router.
Yeah, I mean, I have friends who when Google Fiber came to town, they started turning up 1 gig fiber connections. Is like, you better get new Wi-Fi routers, because your Wi-Fi router can't accommodate that speed anyway. You're wasting it if you don't buy a Wi-Fi router that's got enough capability to stream that over the air, because most of the traditional Wi-Fi router couldn't even handle that. It was beyond its capacity. So it brings me to go ahead.
Well, I was going to say no, and I think but in the current kind of infrastructure spending, there's a lot of big broadband push. I mean, there's still places that need more broadband, both around the country and certainly internationally. But in terms of the ability of our existing hardware and existing technologies to keep up with that, that I don't worry about at all. On the contrary, in some ways it's kind of, it's become, there's this weird economic dynamic, as we talked so much about, but where the Googles and Facebooks, getting the infrastructure built is a reasonable cost to take on if it means more eyeballs for their ads. And that's a wild dynamic, and that's playing out more globally than kind of in local broadband. But that to me indicates a kind of a saturation in a positive way. So.
Yeah, it's sort of a strange version of Moore's law. I mean, that the cost of the infrastructure is not necessarily going down for installation, but relative to the revenues, right? It's worth it to add the capacity at what would be, I'll call it a fixed cost, right? I mean, laying an undersea cable. Maybe it's a little cheaper, maybe it's a little more expensive than it was 20 years ago, but fundamentally it's not a ton different, right? It's a tube with fiber optic cables through it, right? At the end of the day, it hasn't changed that much. They got to drag it across and do their thing. That it's sort of amazing to think we figured out how to do that, over 100 years ago, which is, sort of mind blowing in a lot of ways. We talked a little bit about mobile, and we think about mobile and 5G and 6G, whatever may be next, quantum computing, other things like that. Not to ask you to play futurist, but as you think about that, do you see any of that sort of freeing the internet from its tubes or making it less dependent on the tubes? I mean, at this point, I don't see it. There's nothing, to your point, I think there's certainly no economic imperative to do so, but just curious if you're seeing anything or have been exposed to anything that maybe speaks to that.
No, I mean, I'm actually much more focused on energy networks now than data networks. I mean, I think that's a real sticky problem and a kind of problem that's going to be very interesting to see solved in different ways over the next, 3, 5, 10, 20 years, however long it takes. But the data networks, I mean, I think 5G is kind of done what it said it was going to do. I sometimes have to remember to check that I'm on Wi-Fi, not on cellular. And some often the cell phone network is faster than the Wi-Fi network. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. And then a lot of the discussion as well about, some of what people have sort of come down to earth about the other things 5G will do with autonomous driving or stuff like that. I'm hearing a lot less chatter about that. It's the sort of recognition that that more things are going to happen on devices, and then also that the energy issue, the sort of networked energy issue of how we're going to manage a grid that is essentially pumps through 3 times as much electricity because we've electrified all of our home infrastructure and we're charging our car at home, which seems like it's coming a lot faster than people predicted even 6 months ago. Then that is a remarkable, sort of fascinating kind of software problem, and we need new energy infrastructure, but the kind of data dynamics of that seem pretty straightforward. So the data transmission dynamics of that seem pretty straightforward.
So we'll kind of wrap up on tubes and then kind of end with some discussions around some of the work you're working on now. But not to be dramatic, but in many ways, tubes kind of changed my life. I was an accidental CIO. I did not have a background in sort of traditional technology and kind of got thrust into this role for a variety of reasons, and really felt like the book gave me a concrete understanding at a very root physical level of sort of how all this stuff fit together. And it helped, I think, me map mentally onto the work that the network engineers that were on our team and the folks that were working with us as we tried to rebuild this very, very small piece of the internet that was related to what our company was doing at the time. But I think for most people, it's still, the idea of the internet and having sort of a concrete understanding of that is very, very unusual. I think it's incredibly abstract to most people. So I'm just curious, like when you're after writing the book, how did it change your life in any way, either in terms of the way you thought about things or sort of the conversations you had that maybe informed the way you looked at some of these other systems?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, tubes changed my life because it was, you almost think about like an entrepreneur. I mean, I had this idea that, that was kind of a little bit ahead of its time and was able to kind of bring it to, get the book out before anyone else did. And no one's redone it, which I'm proud of. No one's kind of rewritten it yet. It's a little out of date now, but no one has kind of done it again in the same way. And certainly a lot of the themes are so vital now, as we talked about. But yeah, I think, I mean, in terms of the abstraction of it, I mean, it really, I mean, I keep my kids are 9 and 12, and I keep trying to get them my 12-year-old to read it. It hasn't quite happened yet, but they every once in a while I get a message from a friend who's middle schooler, watch the TED Talk version of the book, to sort of understand what the internet really is. So that part's certainly been fun. But in terms of thinking about how I actually conceive of the network, I mean it really is. What's been most remarkable is the kind of the recognition of how important the ownership of these pieces is. And that's, we see that, we've seen just the consequences of that. We have just keep getting bigger and bigger. Certainly in the political discussion, both the 2016 election and 2020, that the impact of the sort of ownership of singular means of communication have been, was really dramatic. And the recognition that it's not just about a TV station or something like that, but really about the kind of the infrastructure of our entire basis of our entire communications has hit home. It's not as if people aren't talking about it. I mean, it's very much a part of the conversation. So,
yeah. So we'll close the book on that book, and then tell us a little bit. I know you've got another book that came out, I think, fairly recently, a book about weather. So tell us a little bit about that book.
Yeah, the Weather Machine came out just before the pandemic, 2019. Got it out before when there's could still have a reading and things like that.
Exactly.
People still want
to see
to
people and talk about it.
Yeah. Yep. And that was about the similar theme. It was about the physical infrastructure of the weather forecast. And what that meant was really to recognize how the weather models that are basically the basis of weather forecasts today are make up a sort of digital twin, a kind of model of the Earth's atmosphere that's informed by this very physical network of sensors and satellites. And so what was interesting to me was that while the internet was kind of, as we talked about, has increasingly become kind of top down and consolidated. The weather network is kind of has these two weird poles where you both need readings from every country on Earth as much as possible, and so you need this kind of diplomacy of meteorology offices from around the globe to share their information. But then you also have this consolidation of only a few sort of supercomputer weather models that so much of our forecast depends on. So I was kind of in for a ride with that one because I, both had to kind of take in this sort of global view, but also understand the kind of supercomputers at the center. And that ended up being a much less a story about the sort of growing power of a couple of the kind of giants, and more a story about the necessity of the sort of government cooperation. And now, over the last couple of years since the book has come out, it's been really interesting to see that sort of private satellite companies kind of begin to mature, and the way in which they are collaborating with government more than I might have expected 2 years ago, because so much of the basis of this technology has come from sort of really a kind of Kennedy, JFK era emphasis on global diplomatic technical systems. The World Meteorological Organization, which is the kind of basis, the UN organization that organizes the exchange of weather data, is like straight line from that to the app on your phone, like no doubt about it. So
wow, yeah, I haven't read it, so I'm gonna pick it up and give it a read because I've really appreciated the way you treated the system that is the internet. So I would suggest, or at least use that this is another one. Yeah. And maybe, I'm sensing a theme. So as we think about projects, you mentioned a couple of things that you're working on, nuclear power, thinking about maybe the energy grid. What are some projects that are that are in the hopper for you that you're thinking about that we might be able to look forward to?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work I've been doing, magazine work, I haven't quite made the leap to another book yet with this, so I'm thinking about it, but has been about sort of climate tech. And it's been really interesting to see the kind of shift from energy as like a kind of business story to sort of innovative energy creating technologies as a kind of startup story, and to see them kind of converge under this kind of label of climate tech, and this recognition that that there's a huge amount of money to be made, and huge amount of impact to be had in sort of remaking our electric grid, and talk about $1 trillion of infrastructure spending. The kind of snap forward of the response to electric vehicles, I think, is really wild. And you see, Ford announced this week that they're accelerating their shift, and not just all electric by 2030, or 2040 or whatever it is, but really speeding that up. And similar to the story with Facebook and Google, perhaps, it's like, give Americans stuff to buy and, we'll buy it. It's like, and that seems to be the formula right now. That's really shifting the conversation around energy and around climate. I mean, just remarkable news every single day, with essentially a reinvention of American manufacturing with electric vehicles. New battery plant announcements, every single day this week, in Georgia and Tennessee, in Arkansas, all over the place. So.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what are the, as a libertarian, obviously I'm skeptical of centralized planning, and I wonder about the second order, the unintended consequences of a shift in this direction. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think when gas powered, when the combustion engine was created and it began to be commercialized, I'm not sure how many people thought about the downstream problems that would yield. Maybe some did, but oftentimes if there's money to be made, those potential problems will either be overlooked through optimism or hidden. I mean, if you're more of a skeptical person, it could be hidden. Mostly, I think it's overlooked. People don't. It's hard to. They're called unintended consequences for a reason, because you don't necessarily know what's going to happen. So I am curious to see sort of how that evolves. I mean, the grid is a problem, obviously, that's pretty well known. Mainly through news media. You have situations like that, what happened in Texas, that seem to indicate a problem with the grid, and sort of a meeting of a strange climate event at the same time. Sort of, I think, pointed to two different potential issues. Sort of meeting in the middle, if you will. But I am curious. I mean, in terms of what you've read and you thought about, what are some of the downstream or some of the maybe the more negative things that people, some of the skeptics of sort of the the electrification of the automobile, what are some of those problems that people are thinking about?
Of the well, I think it's, I mean, I think that, I mean, the biggest things really does seem to be, the fact, can we build up a charging network, right? And that's, and not only just put chargers on the side of the roads, but also build the power network to serve them. There was just an announcement yesterday from a consortium of electric utility companies that they're going to put, I forget what the number was. I literally just was just sharing this with a friend. But essentially by the end of 2023, you're going to have a robust interstate charging network. End of 2023. So we're talking, 18 months.
18 months, yeah.
18 months to have a transformation of to have chargers at every rest stop in the country. And that's, this is a problem. The reason for that, certainly a lot of the federal spending is sort of juicing that along. But it's also the pre-orders for the F-150 Lightning, and the sort of pretty obvious sense that that the writing is on the wall in terms of a market demand for this kind of charging. So I wouldn't want to get into the gas station business right now. That seems like a pretty bad bet. And there is I think there is a kind of breaking of the dam in terms of the sort of fixed idea that that internal combustion engines are a superior technology, where it's just a remarkable turnaround, and
in a very short period of time, really, right? I mean, it's pretty incredible.
And just purely, don't bet against the American consumer. It's like, give us a cool pickup truck.
When the going gets tough, the tough go shopping, right? I mean, we like new stuff.
And as soon as so if you've and don't bet against the market's ability to supply those chargers very, very quickly.
Right. Yeah. Although it's interesting, will it create? I mean, sort of I feel like there's these sort of threads all coming together for you. But in terms of the power generation required to support those charging stations, right? Will it at least initially require a heavier load on fossil fuels in the short term? I mean, it feels like it could possibly.
There's a lot of stuff happening pretty quietly. What did I just Amazon announced? I forget again. I'm sorry, I should have these numbers at my fingertips, but something like 3,000 or 5,000 megawatts of renewable power procurement over the next 2 years. So this is nuclear power.
That's fast. Again, fast. Yeah.
Nuclear power plant is a couple thousand. The state of I was just looking at these numbers for a nuclear article. The state of New Jersey is somewhere on the order of I think around 6,000 megawatts is powers New Jersey, right? Amazon's doing 4,000 in 2 years.
All right, they're going to take a state
of all renewable.
Right.
And so that and to get if you want to build renewable power, all you got to do is build solar panels and wind power. And so you're cranking out these machines, and then you don't have you have a manufacturing economy rather than a resource economy. And that's just the way in which it's occurring to people that this might be a positive. If you've got a big battery factory in Georgia, it's gonna scramble a lot of things. It's gonna everyone's in a bit of a ride with that. So
yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a lot. I want to let you get back to it. And just to kind of wrap, is there anything we've talked obviously about some larger systems and some bigger sort of issues around technology, but kind of coming down, it's holiday season. We've talked some about shopping. What interesting, what are you seeing interesting that's going on tech wise, or that you're following or paying attention to, kind of more at a lower level?
Yeah. I have a bee in my bonnet with a lot of this electrification stuff, because I hadn't realized, one thing that really didn't click to me was that you can't have a conversation about, you can't talk about climate goals or decarbonizing the grid without recognizing that we need to triple the amount of electricity we produce, because we're going to also electrify our home heating, and we're also going to electrify our automobile, things like that. So the triple thing. That's really, that's pretty much what I'm focused on. But I guess I point to this concept, this personal infrastructure concept. If you've thought about that at all,
No, tell me about that.
Yeah, well, it's really about your personal infrastructure is your hot water heater and your air conditioner and your broadband router and it's kind of all the things in your home that kind of make up your infrastructure. But
Gotcha.
the trick in that and the thing that I find so fascinating is that infrastructure is kind of public. Infrastructure is shared. You don't really have personal infrastructure. Infrastructure is always about a kind of society or sort of system-wide level. So there's a bit of a contradiction to say personal infrastructure. But what it indicates is the possibility that you have these sort of individual systems, solar panels on your roof, but they also have to join together. And so you have, so this idea, just the example, these sort of virtual power plants. If you have an entire community with solar panels on their roof, and you can dispatch that excess power using software in different ways, then you have a virtual power plant. It's not a single sort of smoking building, down behind the dump, but it becomes a kind of software dispatch thing. And so we've kind of set the stage for that with our data networks, and we set the stage for that with our individual devices, our data devices that we are now kind of live with. But it's gonna be interesting to see how that kind of distributed and individual device idea begins to translate to our own oil refineries, i.e., the solar on the roof that charges the 150, the F-150 Lightning.
Right. Instead of just taking that excess, that excess energy and maybe getting a credit back from your power company, sort of taking that to its logical conclusion, right, and being able to it becomes a resource that is really can be managed in a much more sophisticated way because it's constant and consistent, right? It would be something that you could do.
Yeah, I mean, right. And it kind of, there's nothing, there's again, it's going to scramble so many things, but, there's nothing free about being reliant on a fossil fuel company, right? It's like, it's going to scramble the way that we think about a lot of these systems now, which is pretty exciting because there are some intended and unintended consequences of that infrastructural shift that I think will be pretty interesting. So.
Well, on that note, we will we'll let you get back to the writing desk. Andrew, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today on Cut the Shit. We really appreciate it.
Oh, I hope you did. Okay, good.
Yeah, take care. Happy holidays.
You too. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. As a reminder, we're taking a break for the holidays, so our next episode won't drop until January 18th, 2022. If you can't wait until then, drop us a line and maybe we'll make a little cameo-style recording for you. If you are enjoying this podcast, we'd be most grateful if you would share it with others who you think might be interested in hearing an irreverent take on the arcane world of IT. You can find links to this podcast on our website at plow.net, on our YouTube and Instagram feeds, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, LinkedIn, and probably a bunch of other places too. Or as my kids like to say, just Google that shit. You'll find it for sure. Take care and have a great day.